witnessed, many of my colleagues look back and say, I was a tiny piece of a puzzle that ensured that maybe another nearly 3,000 people didn't die. They look back on the program itself, I would say not with regret. They feel that that was a piece of the puzzle that might have helped keep Americans safe. But they do look back, I think, with a knowledge that an America that once said, do anything to ensure there's not a second event, very quickly, I think surprisingly quickly said, what you did, some Americans, what you did was wrong. That's painful for my colleagues. Many of them would look at the program and say, that will never happen again in my lifetime. Not because they regret it, or because they're embarrassed about it, or because they thought it was ineffective, but because they know, as people who have experience through these searing moments, they know that if a program like that were ordered by another president, years down the road, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, people would say, what did you do? Why did you do it? And now you may be even culpable for legal action by the next administration. Some of my friends were investigated for years by the Department of Justice. So in terms of the program itself, I think my friends look back and say, we were a piece of a difficult time in America that will never happen again. And maybe we helped ensure that another kid gets to grow up with their parents. In terms of the ethics, I think the best capture of this was with one of the most thoughtful officers. I don't name people in the book typically because I told them I would not, and because I don't want them getting hate mail. One of the most thoughtful officers I ever worked with gave me a snapshot of ethical thinking that I think captured a lot of what I witnessed. And that was, there's technical pieces of ethical thinking. What is the law of the U.S. government? Does the law allow you to do something? That's a Department of Justice piece of paper that says what you're doing complies with the Constitution and federal law. What does the regulation of your agency say? Is there formal guidance that says what you're doing complies with what this agency has written down as formal policy? And then you start getting tough. Those are pretty straightforward. There's a classic question as you step down the list of ethical questions. How clearly can you explain this in a public audience? We used to call this the Washington Post test. If you're in front of a journalist, I now do CNN for a living, so it's similar to the Washington Post test. Can you capture what you're doing and why in one sentence that your mother would understand? And if you can't, be careful. And the last test that I think my friends have to think about regularly, I still think about it. What would your mother say? I don't care what the law says. I don't care what regulations are. I don't care what the Washington Post says. What would your mother say? Using those litmus tests to look back on the program, I think most people still look back and say, I'm not sure I can give you a perfect answer to every question. But I am sure of one thing. If you step back in time and drove down the GW Parkway in the spring of 2002 and recollected people jumping off buildings, and you thought that maybe you're a tiny sliver of the response that prevented that from happening again, they still sleep at night. Thanks for listening to my story. We'll take questions. Because there's a televised component of this, I'm going to insist, I was told to insist, so don't blame me. I'm going to insist that you go to the microphone.